So, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for connecting this afternoon at our Transform Work. Thank you very much for joining this first session of this week. So my name is Marta Rocchi. I'm assistant professor in business ethics at DCU Business School, and I will be the MC for today's session with Professor David Collings. So as you may know, the Transform series is a new free online seminar series that explores the impact of digital transformation on business and society. So we'll be covering 6 areas, and today in particular we will start the third week of these appointments, and it is on the future of work. So we're delighted to be joined today by Professor David Collings. Thank you very much for joining us. David is a full professor of human resource management in DCU Business School, and he is Associate Dean for Research in the same school here in Dublin City University. So he has been named by the HR magazine one of the most influential thinkers internationally on the themes related to HR, and he's on the board of many of the most important journals of his area. And we are very, very honored to have David with us today. Feel free for all your participants, the chat function will be not, you will not be able to use the chat function, but the Q&A, you can type your questions for David, and at the end of his presentation, we will collect the questions for David to answer. So I won't keep you more with this introduction. I really thank David for his availability of joining the Transform series today. The Transform series organized by the Irish Institute of Digital Business and DCU Business School. And so thank you very much, David. The floor is yours, and I'll see you for the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Marta, for the lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I also want to thank Molly and the team in the IIDB for all the work that goes on behind the scenes in making events like today possible. There's certainly a lot that goes on behind the scenes to make these events happen. So like I say, it's my pleasure to be with you. The topic of my talk today is around enabling the workforce of the future. And really, I'm drawing on a couple of key pieces of research that I've been involved in over the last number of years in some of the ideas I'm presenting today. The first of those is a study which was explicitly titled Enabling the Workforce of the Future, which was sponsored and supported by SkillNet Ireland and the Irish Institute of Training and Development. And that was co-authored with my colleague in DCU, Dr. John McMacken. And that piece of work was kind of a large study where we did a number of things. So firstly, we did a number of focus groups with key stakeholders. So we spoke to policy stakeholders, we spoke to educational stakeholders, and we spoke to professional bodies. So the likes of some of the accountancy bodies, Engineers Ireland, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and other kind of representative bodies of key areas of work and employment nationally. The second part of our study then was we worked with a number of organizations, 21 organizations globally. Many of these were big employers globally and well-known brands. So some of the organizations that agreed to be named in that study, the likes of Novartis, Dell, Zurich Insurance, and a range of other organizations across sectors, headquartered in a number of countries. And really what we were interested in there is really getting under the hood of how those organizations were thinking about the future of work and the kind of things that they were doing to enable their workforces to prepare for the future of work. And then the final stage in that research was we did a survey of 250 HR and learning and development practitioners in the UK and Ireland. And that's a piece of work we've continued to keep up to date in the context of COVID. So the research took place at the back end of 2019. But through 2020, we've continued to keep updated on those interviews. We've done a number of more interviews, and we've seen some very clear evidence about how some of the trends we were seeing impacted on what those organizations were thinking in terms of the future skills in the context of COVID. The second piece of work that I'm drawing on to a degree is work that's ongoing, again with my colleague here at DCU, John McMacken, but also with colleagues at the University of South Carolina, so Pat Wright and Anthony Nyberg in particular. And that research was funded by the DCU COVID-19 Hub. And here we're looking at the response of Chief Human Resource Officers to COVID, and how HR is in many ways leading the response in a lot of organizations to some of the challenges that are emerging in COVID. And a large part of that, particularly in the kind of early to mid days, was around reskilling workforces for doing work differently than they've done in the past. So obviously the shift to home working, the challenges that brought around well-being, work-life balance, and those types of skills, and how they kind of manage the tension between the short-term priorities of enabling work to happen in the context we find ourselves in now, yet not losing sight of the end game here when we come out the other side of the short-term challenges around COVID, and what the workplace is likely to look like, and how that ensures that the organization can deliver on its strategy in that context. So broadly, there are kind of a couple of the big research projects I've been involved in around the theme of the future of work, and as I say, I'm going to draw insights from them. So I guess our starting point here was largely that there's a lot of hype around the future of work and what it means from organizations. Here's just some headlines we pulled from various media sources, which predate COVID, but nonetheless, I think capture a lot of the media narrative around the future of work. And a lot of the narrative we found was there were two key themes in it. One was that this technology was likely to challenge labor markets in terms of making a lot of work and different types of jobs redundant. And the second thing was that it was something that was in the future, and there was almost a sense of comfort that this was something that was going to happen rather than something that was actually happening in the here and now. So you see from the FFT, more than 100,000 legal roles to become automated. The Associated Press will no longer use real live journalists to write reports for minor league baseball. Future of finance, more data, fewer people. So again, the predictions here, a lot of them are around job losses and people being replaced by work. If we look at the impact of technology in the context of COVID, I would certainly argue that a lot of the trends that were already happening have been accelerated. So for example, some data from McKinsey would suggest that US e-commerce, so the amount of trade done electronically in stores, grew at a rate expected over 10 years in the first quarter of 2020 alone. If we look at medicine and the delivery of medicine in the UK National Health Service, only about 7% of consultations happened virtually in 2019. That number was closer to 99% this year. So work has been transformed in many, many ways. I think though, one of the key things that came through very clearly in our research is that rather than technology displacing jobs, what's much more likely is that we'll see a lot of work being augmented by technology in organizations. So the actual job losses that come from the advances in technology may be lesser than some predictions that have been made, but actually the impact will be significant in terms of changing how work is done and requiring employees to develop particular skill sets. This is a slide I've used a number of times over the last number of months to capture some of the priorities of organizations as we came into 2020. It's a slide from the PwC CEO Pulse survey that was issued at Davos at the start of this year, when I don't think too many of us could have predicted that the impact of COVID was to turn out as great as it has been. But these were the challenges that CEOs were thinking about in terms of their workforces and their requirement to upskill workforces. And I should have said at the outset that kind of one of the themes in my talk today is really about a shift in how we think about things from work to skills. And one of the things I would argue very strongly is we need to really frame the narrative about the future of work around skills, because skills are really what enables organizations to be effective and are going to be core to employability and a lot of these trends moving forward. So back to our friends at PwC. So what did their data show? So they asked CEOs, what are the key things that are driving the discussions in your organization around the future of skills and the future of work? And there were kind of 4 big buckets that came up. The first one was around the automation of work, what we've just been talking about. And you can see here, there's 3 different bar charts. The first one was changes that those CEOs expected in the early part of the current century, so the early part of the 2020s. Wave 2 was to the end of the 2020s, and then the third wave was kind of after the 2020s. And I would certainly argue that there is no doubt that these trends have been accelerated over the last number of months. But what you can see is some interesting data. So firstly, the expectation was that there wasn't likely to be much change in the first part of the century. So you can see the 3 bars. The first one is low work and jobs for people with low levels of education. The middle bars with mid levels of education, and the orangey color bars is high levels of education. So there was very little predicted change in the first kind of part of the 2020s. There's no doubt that that has shifted, and there has been a significant impact of technology over the last number of months, as I said. But what's really interesting, if you look at the second block there, while there's predicted to be some jobs at potential risk from technology, the group that are at the biggest risk are those in the mid-education range. So not the low-skilled work particularly, not the high-skilled work, but the ones in the middle. And how I would interpret that is that a lot of work in that low skill category, the technology is still too expensive to replace employees. So it's more effective to continue to pay individuals to do that work. And the technology hasn't really caught up in terms of that kind of return on investment of doing that work manually. But it's those middle skill jobs where technology has the greatest potential to free up capacity for people to take on higher value added work when that lower value added work can be automated. One great example we saw from a professional service company in our research was where a piece of audit work that had taken a relatively junior auditor up to 2 weeks to complete had been automated as part of a recent transformation program and was literally done through technology in a matter of minutes. So freeing up significant capacity for that individual to do higher value added work in the organization. So it'll be really interesting to see how those trends play out over the next number of years in terms of how that balance between where technology is having the greatest impact is. The second big thing that was challenging CEOs as they thought about the future of work and the future of skills was around falling unemployment. So this graph is pretty consistent across the world. Since the last big recession a decade ago, we've seen a significant fall off in unemployment rates across the globe, relatively tight labour markets in most developed economies. Clearly, one of the impacts of COVID is that there's a lot more talent on the labour market than there was at the beginning of the year, as significant sectors and industries have been hugely challenged by the pandemic. But the big challenge now moving forward is, are the skills and capabilities of that work that has been displaced and those individuals that are currently unemployed or furloughed or whatever the case may be, how easy transferable are their skills and capabilities to other sectors? So nationally, you'll have seen a significant policy agenda with organisations like SkillNet Ireland and Solus to the fore in terms of reskilling and upskilling employees to transition from one sector to another. And one of the interesting things we do see in some of the research that's out there on how technology impacts on work is a lot of individuals who are in jobs that get displaced by technology tend to move into jobs that are equally at risk and just haven't caught up yet. So we really need to think about, as a society, how we make those people employable as we move forward. A trend that has definitely been accelerated in the context of COVID is a declining level of mobility of talent across borders. So prior to COVID, some of the big challenges that we saw here were the impact of Brexit in the UK being a very local example, where EU citizens' right to live and work in the UK has been significantly impacted by the Brexit decision. And there's a lot of uncertainty for many professionals and also non-professionals living and working in the UK in terms of their future employment status and really impacting there. We've also seen on the other side of the Atlantic, the US administration under Donald Trump and how it has recast the H-1B visa program and general discussions there around keeping work in America for Americans. And we've seen this on a global scale, a decline in people's willingness to relocate internationally. Clearly, in the short term, that's been significantly challenged by the impact of COVID. And the last trend is one that is well written about and well understood at this stage, and that's the fact that the population is significantly aging in most developed economies. So how do we kind of transition from where the ratio of working to non-working people is significantly challenged? We see some people like Linda Grattan at London Business School thinking about this idea of a 100-year life now, where there's a good chance, a reasonable chance that somebody born now has a chance to live to 100 years. So what does that mean for the way we think about work and employment, which traditionally stopped in kind of the mid-60s, while potentially somebody has still 35 years of life left at that stage? And one of our predictions is that we'll have multiple careers as we go through our life, or multiple career stages, and we might come back to that later. What does that look like in reality? So here are a couple of really interesting data points that we found when we looked into the existing research when we started to do ours. The first is the growing impact of AI and robotics on work. So one data point was that the predicted spend on robotics globally in 2020 was predicted to be $188 billion US dollars, which was a 100% increase in spending over the past 5 years, so since 2016. So we were seeing a very steep incline in the investment in robotics as certain types of work became more automated. So the robots in the picture here are picking robots in an Amazon packaging facility, which is one area where we've seen significant growth, although not perfect in terms of their ability to do those tasks, but significant nonetheless. We saw some very high-profile research being done by some colleagues in Trinity College last year, where they were developing robotics for healthcare settings, robots that were capable of interacting with elder patients in healthcare settings and interacting on a social level. So we're seeing robotics shift into areas of work that we may never have predicted before, and where there would be, I guess, an expectation in the past that that area of work was safe. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of concerns about robotics and ethical concerns about them and the like, but nonetheless, it's happening. And currently, we're seeing the use of robotics in terms of the use of robotics in cleaning in healthcare settings and in hospitality settings. In terms of skills, one of the things that comes through very clearly is we're much more likely to see work evolving towards a model where technology and humans work together, and that's where the sweet spot is going to be in terms of value add. So one of the studies we came across when we were doing our research was a study that looked at cancer detection. And this study compared cancer detection rates by artificial intelligence alone, cancer detection rates by physicians alone, and situations where the physicians use technology to augment their decision making. And what that study found was that the error rate when physicians made detections without the use of artificial intelligence to inform them was about 3.5%. When artificial intelligence was making those assessments alone, the error rate was 7.5%. Well, when both worked together, the error rate came down to 0.5%. So I think that's indicative of the potential of technology and human interaction to make better decisions and to add more value to organizations. Excuse me. And the last one, again, reinforcing this idea that the future of work is really the importance of skills in the future of work. Some research looked at the half-life of skills from university degrees. So by half-life, we mean how long does it take half what you learned on your degree program to become redundant? And some research looked at engineering skills, so undergraduate degrees in engineering. And 100 years ago, the prediction was that if you did a degree in engineering, the half-life of your skills was about 30 years. So it would take 30 years from when you completed your degree for half that knowledge to become redundant. The prediction is that now, in the current environments, the half-life of those skills is as little as 3 to 5 years. So we can see in this discipline, individuals finishing college and half their skill set becoming redundant within 3 to 5 years. So that's a really compelling way to think about the future work, and to challenge our assumptions of the past, where somebody does a degree program in this instance and is set up for a career in industry, to a requirement for constant upskilling and constant investment in one's capabilities through the future work. Again, this is back to PwC data, but this is some PwC data that said, to those CEOs, right? You recognize there's a skills gap. How are you going about filling those skills gaps in your organization? And we can see that the different bars in the chart are simply different geographic regions. And the different elements of the bar are basically the different ways in which I can fill those skills gaps. So the bottom part of the bar is around internal reskilling and upskilling. So how do I use the employees I have and develop their skills to meet my skill needs? The next three, so the two grey colours and the red colour, are about external hiring. So the first bit is hiring outside the industry. The second bit is hiring graduates direct from education, and the third bit is hiring from competitors. And you basically see that for most of the globe, this is a huge chunk of how organizations are thinking about meeting their skills needs. So organizations are really over-focused on external hiring would be one of our key arguments, and I'll come back to some of the challenges around that. And the little yellow bit at the top then is really thinking about the contingent workforce. So for example, using the gig economy as a means to meet some of my skills and capabilities requirements. And again, that's a very small part. And I think in this context, I think that in many ways the gig economy gets a bad name, because at the lower end of the gig economy, there are certainly some workers in vulnerable positions who have very little option but to work in that economy, and creates a whole number of challenges. But there's a very high-end, high-skilled gig economy as well, where we see lots of potential to tap into talent that may not be available elsewhere. So this argument that there's an over-reliance on external sourcing, what does that mean? Well, there's a consistent body of research over a number of decades that shows that organizations are generally over-reliant on external hiring. And also that external hiring is really hard to get right. And some of the evidence from that research is pretty compelling. Firstly, we know that to recruit externally generally costs more. And I'm not talking about the recruitment costs, I'm talking in terms of the salary that I have to pay somebody that I recruit externally. One study in the US showed that in financial services, about an 18% premium is what external hires were paid relative to internal hires in organizations. So we tend to overpay people that we bring in from outside. But more worryingly, the research very consistently shows that when I hire a high performer from outside my organization, there's only about a 50% chance that that high performer will be able to match the level of performance they had in their prior organization when they come and join my organization. So about a 50% chance. And that research is consistent in a number of contexts and across a number of studies. So individuals really struggle to bring that high performance from one organization to another, and organizations really struggle to understand the factors that make that performance transferable. And one of the reasons, again, coming back to this argument that we need to focus on skills, is that organizations tend to overvalue experience relative to other measures. So this was a study that was summarized in Harvard Business Review just towards the back end of last year. And this was a major meta-analysis that looked at individuals moving from one organization to other and the value of experience. And it showed very conclusively that experience is a very bad predictor, is a poor predictor of somebody's performance when they move from one organization to another. And what we really need to focus on is displayed performance and skills and capabilities, because they're the things that are a lot better predictors of performance in a new role. So again, this focus on skills comes back into focus for us. This is some research from McKinsey again that was published in the context of COVID. And they're very strongly arguing that to emerge stronger from the COVID crisis, companies should start reskilling their workforces now. There's research that has been done that looked at previous recessions. So Rob Ployhart at the University of South Carolina did some really interesting research looking at the last recession and found that organizations who had invested in skills and capability development prior to the recession performed much better through the recession and were better prepared to exit the recession. And that's certainly something we're hearing a lot in our ongoing research with organizations around learning and development, that there is a greater understanding of the importance of reskilling and upskilling, and a greater understanding of the importance of managing employee skills in this way, albeit with some tensions. I think what's really interesting from this slide here is if you look at the skills that are predicted to be particularly important in the future, it's clearly not just the technical skills, they're there for sure, but it's also higher cognitive skills, so critical thinking skills and decision-making skills and technology skills. So if you look at the first bar there, critical thinking and decision-making skills, in our CHRO study, one of the things we heard consistently from Chief Human Resource Officers was that in their organizations, they saw a lot of leaders really struggle with decision-making in the context of the uncertainty that came with the pandemic. So their frames of reference were so challenged and they were so much out of their comfort zone that they really struggled to adapt to make decisions in this environment. So for those organizations, the ability to make decisions in uncertain contexts was what was a competency that became hugely important in differentiating those high-performing leaders from others. Critical thinking skills to the fore, other higher cognitive skills, so project management they classify in that bucket, complex information processing and interpretation. So again, if you look at the context of COVID, one of the challenges that organizations were faced with was that initially there was very little data to make decisions upon, because and secondly, the decision or the data was changing so rapidly that really the requirement of individuals to process this really complex data and make decisions was really, really challenged in the current context. The second most important skill set people talk about are those kind of leadership and management skills, and aligned with that, adaptability and continuous learning. So those, what we might call soft skills, or which this study calls social and emotional skills, really, really important, almost as important as those technical skills. And it's really only kind of those dark blue ones, data analytics and mathematical skills, advanced IT skills, they're third in the hierarchy in terms of the skills that come in here. But what's really important is the future will require people to merge all of these skills together. And one of the biggest challenges we found in our research on the future of work was that leaders in organizations recognized the challenge they had in the availability of skills. So again, this is another slide from PwC. And here, these are actually the Irish cut of the data. Individuals were asked, what are the key challenges to delivering on the growth prospects of your organization? And top of the pile here was the availability of key skills. So CEOs recognized that skills were one of their key priorities. Yet when we asked learning and development professionals, what are your key, how important is the future of work for your organization as a strategic priority, you can see only about 40% of them said that it was a high priority or a top priority. So only 4 in 10 organizations were really identifying the priority of the focus in work. And fewer than that, only about a third of respondents were confident about their abilities and their preparedness for the future work. And one of the reasons we argued that was the case was that leaders in organizations, HR leaders, L&D leaders, were under so much pressure in the short term to deliver skills and capabilities for the here and now that they had very little capacity to focus on future skills needs. Our wider research on HR and the role of HR in organizations would suggest that this is a pretty consistent theme in organizations, that when organizations have a clear strategy for where they want their business to go in terms of their key priorities, the key markets they want to serve, their key products, etc., they often fail to drill down into the talent implications for those strategies and end up in a position that when the time comes that they need skills and capabilities, they haven't been proactive enough in developing those skills. So they're not thinking about talent in a proactive enough way. It's very much short-sighted in the here and now, and too far down the decision-making cycle to really allow them to be as proactive as they should be in terms of delivering on talent. Now, interestingly, there are some data that suggest that this is beginning to shift a little bit in the context of COVID. So some LinkedIn Learning research that was published in the middle of the summer suggested that L&D leaders in organizations were reporting 159% increase in the extent to which CEOs were championing learning in organizations. And 64% of those respondents said that upskilling was more of a priority in their organizations than it had been in the past. So we saw some very clear trends over COVID where organizational leaders recognized much more clearly the deficiencies in their people capability and recognized the challenges people were facing as they shifted to different forms of organization. So if you're thinking about what all this means for your organization and how organizations can better prepare their workforce for the future, this is a framework that John and I developed based on our research, which we kind of argue offers a roadmap for organizations in terms of thinking about how they might enable their workforces for the future. There's an article forthcoming in Sloan Management Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, that summarizes the thinking here and updates it in the context of COVID. I don't have a final version of it to share, but if anybody's interested, please just reach out to me and I'm more than happy to share it when it does become available. But this kind of brings together a lot of our thinking, and I think provides a very useful roadmap for organizations to think about the future of work and skills. So we start at the center of the star here, and what we saw pretty consistently in those organizations that were well prepared for the future of work and the future of upskilling was that they had a very clear vision for what role the likes of artificial intelligence, robotics, whatever the technology was, would have on their organization, and it was driven by their strategy. So for example, one of the banks we spoke with had a very clear vision to digitize its business operations. This predated COVID, but certainly in our follow-up interviews, we've seen that it became even more of a priority during COVID. And from that digitization drive, the bank had developed a set of core people capabilities that would enable it to deliver on that ambition from a digital point of view, and had downstream aligned its HR processes very much to deliver on that. Another example was Dell Computers, which was evolving from a company that was very much about computer hardware to a company that was positioning itself as a data and technology infrastructure company, and again had developed a core set of people capabilities that would enable it to deliver on that agenda, which very strongly informed its HR practices. So I guess on one level you're thinking that's pretty obvious, but actually what we saw in a number of organizations is that they were kind of literally just kind of following the technology without any great strategy and the like, and they were always playing catch up because there wasn't a clear vision in the organization for what the role of technology was in the workforce of the future, or alignment between the organizational strategy and the people strategy. So they were very reactively chasing the strategy all the time without really having a clear priority around where they were going in this space. Those organizations that were more advanced in thinking about the future of work, the first thing that they had was an understanding of the skills and capabilities they had in the organization. So again, maybe a couple of examples will help illustrate what we mean here. So one technology company in Dublin, an Irish headquartered technology company that we spoke with, talked about how they had just completed a big skills audit within their organization. So partnering with a local skillnet, they had done a complete mapping of every job in their organization to understand the skills and capabilities required for each job. And they had also done an audit of employee skills to understand the skills that their employees had. And this was a really important starting point for them on their journey of thinking about the future of work. So the first thing they discovered was that they had some skills and capabilities in their employees that they didn't know they had. which really helped them think about as they were moving forward what skills they had and could develop versus what they needed to develop externally. Interestingly, though, that organization also identified that in a number of core roles in the middle of their organization, they had over-recruited. So the people in those roles had skills and capabilities that they were never deploying in their jobs. And they identified €1 million worth of potential cost savings based on the over-recruitment they were doing for those roles. And a number of organizations were coming at this in a different way, but fundamentally it was about understanding the baseline of skills they had in their organization, because in many instances, they had a lot of the capabilities they would need moving forward, or at least the baseline capabilities which could be upskilled. The next step for the organizations that were further down the track here was really thinking about how their business was evolving and what that meant for different roles in the organization. So one insurance company, our study, had partnered with an external provider and done a considerable amount of research into jobs in their organization and how those jobs were likely to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years. And the outcome of that was a very specific list of 15% of jobs that they expected to be completely replaced by technology, and a further 50% of jobs that they expected to be augmented by technology in a significant way. So that provided them with a very clear roadmap of where specifically they needed to upskill their employees and where they needed to reskill employees because the jobs they were in were likely to be made redundant if the organization didn't do a good job in moving those employees to other parts of the organization and providing them with the skills and capabilities to move on to different roles. And we found in that organization, those skills became particularly valuable in the context of COVID, because as some of the trends they were predicting accelerated, they already had a roadmap in place in terms of how do I get those skills up to speed. And they also had a very clear roadmap where if parts of the business were less busy than others and there was a bit of slack, how can I use that time to reskill people to help us on that journey towards the new vision for the future of that organization. And the fourth step is very much about thinking about the resources in the learning and development team. And we saw a number of trends already happening prior to COVID that I think have again been accelerated by COVID. So in terms of who is delivering learning and development, what learning and development looks like, I think this step speaks to some of the broader changes we were seeing. So historically, when we thought about a learning and development professional, we generally thought about somebody who was good at designing content and delivering content. So somebody who could put together a great training program, stand at the top of the room and deliver it. We were already seeing prior to COVID a shift away from that model and seeing a shift towards learning and development professionals being much closer to the business in terms of understanding what was going on in the business. So in some organizations, we saw the development of learning councils where business leaders and learning and development and HR leaders work together to really understand some of the trends we were talking about in step 1, 2, and 3. But equally, we saw, learning and development professionals moving their focus away from design and delivery of learning to really becoming curators of learning. So using things like data analytics to understand what employees were looking for in terms of accessing learning and development. So drawing down data from learning management systems, using predictive analytics to try and think about what skills and capabilities individuals might need. And then very much a focus on curating content. So rather than designing content from scratch, an emphasis on identifying content that was already available and curating individual learning journeys where people could access development that was relevant to them at that point in time, that could be accessed in a much more short-term, just in time, just for me, and just for now way. So really it was a shift away from learning experiences that were all classroom-based and very much kind of immersive to much more shorter, sharper learning situations. That said, I think, I won't jump into the next step too quickly. So that was clearly one trend. So we see learning and development professionals evolving significantly, and we see learning teams. We saw some really cool examples of one healthcare company who had used technology in their own team, so had brought in a digital bot to manage the schedule for all of its global learning and development programs, which took an entire headcount out of their team, or freed up an entire headcount in their team to do more value-added work. Step 5 is around planning and implementing, and this is really, the delivery of learning and development. So I mentioned there some of the shifts in terms of curation of content, but we also see some significant shifts, and these have again been amplified in COVID. So even if we look at senior leadership development programs, one of the big things that organizations have been struggling with in the context of COVID is they generally in the past happened by bringing cohorts together physically, a huge focus on the networking and collaborative part of those events. Whereas clearly that wasn't possible in COVID. So we saw leadership and development teams be really innovative in terms of moving the content online, but also trying to find ways to create learning opportunities to those individuals. So it could be things like peer mentoring programs where they mentor together. It could be, for example, creating kind of social context within the virtual environment where people came together with a little bit of a kind of an agenda in terms of how they spent that time rather than totally open, but really trying to create that social interaction and build those networks. Some other really interesting developments we're seeing in terms of how learning and development is being delivered is a shift away from and again, this relates back to the point on skills. So maybe an example is just the clearest way to demonstrate it. So we're seeing the emergence of the idea of internal talent marketplaces. And internal talent marketplaces are fundamentally like a gig economy for skills. So Dell is a great example of an organization that's a bit further down the track here in terms of the stuff it's doing. So Dell has created this internal talent marketplace where managers can put up pieces of work that they're working on, so projects within the organization, and individuals can bid to work on that project as almost a side hustle. So it's not their core day job, it's outside of their own department potentially, and they work on that to gain experience, to build their network within the organization. And the ultimate ambition is to close the loop where other team members can validate that person's skills and capabilities, potentially in terms of what that looks like moving forward. So we're seeing some really innovative approaches to the delivery of learning and development. And obviously the last step then is that continuous improvement cycle. I'm conscious of time, so I'll stop there, but here's a great quote from one of the leaders we spoke about that talks about that balance between technology and people. And he said to us, machines are evolving the world of work, and that's not going to slow down. So that presents us with some real challenges that go beyond just making sure we have talent. It's a matter of maintaining human dignity, and in lots of cases, and making sure that employees get upskilled and feel relevant and they can contribute to the society. So really conscious of the balance between people and technology in his organization. So I'm going to stop there, Marta, in the context of time, but I'm very happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, David, for this insightful presentation, and thank you very much for sharing these thoughts. And I really encourage all the participants to use the Q&A function that they can find at the bottom of their screen so that they can send us their question. I saw there's movement in our Q&A, and I'll just kick off with more general consideration and a question, and I will start then picking the questions from the Q&A. So I would say, David, correct me if I'm wrong, that in light of what you said, you mentioned a lot, all the processes that a company can actually enable now in this moment to change the way they make the best use of talent, of internal people, and also of new people coming in a company. I would say that the future work is a lot linked also to the future of higher education in general. So given your expertise in this field, but also your role in a business school, what do you think would be the main change that higher education should implement to actually take up these new challenges, both of the automation and the post-COVID scenarios?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Martha, and it's one I've thought about, but I can't claim to have got the answer on. I think for sure, and I think we've seen this in a lot of instances. I think one positive is the shift towards a greater appreciation of the importance of work-ready graduates. So in terms of what we do in educating, particularly undergraduates, the importance of those skills that are transferable to the workplace. Whereas I think historically a lot of education institutions underestimated the importance of that. And if you look at the historical status of business schools in many older universities, I think that's indicative of that. It was seen as a real kind of almost vocational type role that business schools played. So I think shifting that importance to work-ready graduates is a big one. I think what we will see, so there's probably likely to be an ongoing value in undergraduate foundational degree type programs where younger people get the opportunity to grow and develop personally. They develop some depth in a particular area. But really the key to it is that we talk about T-shaped graduates, so they have that kind of depth of expertise in their core area. But if that's technical expertise, that we also give them the breadth and kind of the softer or translational skills that are important. And equally, if they're coming from a more social sciences background, that they also have some of that breadth in terms of that technical capability. But I think a much greater focus on lifelong learning, a shift away from an over-reliance on extended master's types programs to things like micro-credentials, to really thinking about learning in smaller chunks than we did in the past. I think we were overly focused on longer term programs in the past and not enough on kind of things like micro-credentials and shorter learning. And I think that's definitely going to be a big part of where we go moving forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's very interesting. And I think I can say that we can be proud of being in a business school, which is actually trying to do this and implement these changes both at the undergraduate level and in the postgraduate education. So there are some questions which will lead us to change a bit the perspective of the conversation, like from this question to these others. So I just go with one in particular from Owen. He asks if you think that the current processes for graduates, I think he's referring to the hiring processes for graduates, is archaic and not conducive to selecting the right candidates. So he mentioned psychometric testing. So what do you think? Like, do you think companies are using archaic processes and ways to hire new people?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Owen. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that graduate recruitment is the worst part of recruitment. I think actually there's a lot of strength in the model that focuses on recruiting out of education and trying to develop talent internally. I think one element that it's broken is an overemphasis on graduates per se. And I think Ireland culturally, I think we probably underestimate the potential of apprenticeship programs as a route into organizations, for example. So rather than saying that the graduate model is broken, I think what we need to do is look beyond and narrow focus on graduates as the only entry route into those entry-level roles in organizations. And I would very strongly advocate for call for a greater appreciation of the value of apprenticeship programs. It's something that didn't end up in our final report because of the focus of the report, but it was something we heard a lot from industries where, logistics is a great example where there was an apprenticeship program developed in logistics. And one of the organizations mentioned a couple of people who had come through that program who went on to have phenomenal careers and climbed the hierarchy much quicker than any graduate did. And one of those that was given to us an example was working in a spar shop and was excluded through traditional routes of education because of her background and other reasons, and suddenly found her way onto this apprenticeship program and just accelerated, and just it was phenomenal to hear of. So I think one thing we need to think about is how do we think about those different routes into organizations, because I think there's a huge amount of potential in things like apprenticeship programs, and I think they should definitely have a renewed focus.
Thank you very much. And I think this topic also links very well to everything that you said about the part in higher education that leads for these people to get a new job. So I was actually very surprised by what you said about the fact that before it was taking 30 years for knowledge of a graduate to be redundant. Now we are on a spectrum of 3 to 5 years. And I think that this consideration is very linked to a question from Gregory, who actually is thanking you for the talk. And he asks, what do you think? I don't know if this is a question too much of a prediction into the future. So we don't have but I'm sure that it's an interesting, at least, question to reflect on. So what do you think would be the average time our generation, so I think he's referring to people actually currently in postgraduate education, that have just finished college, will spend in a job in the future? So I think that we all think about the previous generation, and we can have the experience of people in our families that had like the same job throughout their lives. So what is going to happen for people who are currently in higher education?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gregory. I think it's a really interesting one. So the latest data I've seen suggest, and these are data from LinkedIn, right, suggest that the average time somebody spends in a job in Ireland is about 6 years. The average time in the UK is 5 years. In Silicon Valley, it's 2 years, right? So that's kind of probably the range. 6 years is probably a higher number because it accounts for people like Martha and I that work in the public sector, where 10 years tend to be longer. But even if you look at prior to my generation in universities, most academics went to university and never moved. DCU is the third university I've worked in as a core faculty member, and I've had multiple visiting positions, but I've been in DCU, I'm in my 9th year now. So I'm quite settled, but people are definitely moving for longer period, or after shorter periods of time. I think it'll be really interesting to see. I think a lot of what's out there suggests that the reason people move from one organization to another is because there's significant generational differences and people think differently about work. I'm not so convinced that's the case. I think part of the problem is organizations invest less in people than they did in the past. So if you go back to those generations we spoke about, they worked in organizations where there was a kind of social contract, which was, you come and work with us and we'll create a career path. There tended to be more levels in the hierarchy, so it was easier to get promoted. And organizations tended to kind of manage in a longer term way, whereas so many organizations now are driven by short-term priorities where there's ongoing restructurings, people have to reapply for their jobs. So I don't think it's as simple as people don't want to do it anymore. For me, the way I think about it is if an organization is giving me, I think the one thing that is different now is people want more purpose in their work. So they want to do work that's more meaningful than just going to work and picking up the paycheck. So I think for me, what's really important is finding an organization that's aligned with your values and where there is that sense of purpose. And I think if people find that, I would argue that that's likely to be the strongest predictor of whether they stay with an organization or not. And the people who move more frequently are the ones who've yet to find that space where their purpose is aligned with what the organizations are doing. And I think that's one big change we've certainly seen. I think there are some sectors, and I think banking and finance where people chase salaries, as an example, like, if you think of, a trader in a bank or something like that, that's very much driven by reward. But in a lot of industries, I think there's a lot more focus. So it's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I think for me, that kind of idea of purpose and values is going to be a very strong predictor of how long somebody stays in an organization.
Yeah, that's absolutely interesting, especially, this data that you mentioned from LinkedIn, that I think are very interested for all those who are connected now and who are thinking about rejoining the workforce after having their studies. And I'm absolutely interested in what you said about the fact that people are looking for purpose in what they're doing, not just like a salary at the end of the month. And I'm sure this is the case for all the participants at this seminar this morning, because I think they're also like the mere fact that they're interested in thinking about this topic would make them people that are interested in the purpose of the job that they do. I actually think for the questions that I can see in the Q&A space that we have both people currently in postgraduate education and people who are actually employed. So I would mention the question from Kira. She's actually, I think she's someone who speaks from the inside of a company, and she's actually asking, is there an easy way to bring information on the skills you need in your team to HR to have them consider the future of work? Like if you are inside a company and you're recruiting and you want the HR people, like they're the first filter. So this is a very practical question, David.
Yeah. No, so Kira, if I read the question correctly, it's if you're a manager in an organization, you're trying to influence the HR team to understand the skills that you require in your team. Yeah, is there an easy way? I think a big part of it is the culture in the organization and the culture of the HR team. Like if I was working in HR, I would hope that you know, like one of the things we saw in the learning and development research, for example, was that those organizations that considered themselves more mature placed a huge emphasis on those consulting skills within the business. So really integrating themselves into the business, partnering with leaders in the organization to really understand the trends that were happening. Most people I know that work in HR, you know, want to deliver value for the business. So I would certainly encourage you to you know, start the dialogue with your HR partner, business partner, or whoever you work with, and start the dialogue around the types of skills that you need in your business. And I think, you know, concrete examples of where the skill sets that are coming into your business don't match with what you need, or how to be more proactive about that. You know, one of the tools we use when we work with HR teams is scenario planning. So really thinking about, you know, the business strategy of where the business wants to go, and then really drilling into what that means for skills and capabilities, and how the organization can kind of recruit and develop ahead of the curve to try and have those skills and capabilities in place before they actually need them. So I don't know if that's such a concrete example, but I'd certainly initiate the conversation. Most HR professionals that I know want to deliver the value that the organization needs, and it's really trying to challenge them and help them understand the skills and capabilities that you require.
I think Kira is very satisfied with the answer. She just typed a comment that this is exactly what she was looking for. So thank you very much, David, for this answer. I would stay on the side of the companies, and we have Ashling asking how can a small company or a startup can prioritize the future of work and upskilling from within when the resources are limited? Because of course, when we think about automation, we tend to think to big companies and the availability of plenty of resources. What should a small company do?
Yeah, no, Ashton, great question. So I you know, in the business school, we do a lot of work with Enterprise Ireland and Invest Northern Ireland around fast growth companies, and particularly I teach on the Invest Northern Ireland program, and a lot of these companies are exactly the kind of organization you're referring to there, that don't have dedicated HR functions and don't have tons of resources. And what I really challenge the leadership teams in those organizations to do is create space to discuss people and skills in their leadership team meetings. And my experience is, in general, that many leadership teams, but particularly in smaller organizations, don't give people management issues enough time in senior leadership discussion. So creating time and space in the senior leadership team discussion for questions around people, skills, work, to the same degree that questions around finance, production, other key areas of the business get time and space for discussion. To me, that's a hugely important part of it. And at least if it's on the agenda and it's regularly spoken about, there's the opportunity to develop an understanding about where the business is going and what that means for those critical areas.
So thank you very much. I would say, yeah, so there are at least, there's another question from someone who is actually in higher education, I guess. So is asking, do you think it's more important for graduates to get real life experiences as opposed to continuing education straight after the undergraduate degree?
Yeah, probably yes. I think so. So when I worked in the UK, most people went straight from undergraduate into graduate programs. Something I've noticed in Ireland is a lot more people continue to do a master's degree and then move into graduate programs to get experience. So I think the market is slightly more competitive in Ireland, where a lot of people in the market have a postgraduate degree when they apply for graduate programs and the like. So I think that's where the graduate program, a postgraduate might give you some added value or make you a little bit more competitive relative to somebody with an undergrad. I think one of the advantages of coming from a school like DCU or UL is you come to the market with your work experience from your co-op or your intro program. And I think that certainly is a big differentiator for people. I would say the value of internships, where you can find opportunities for internships during your degree program, hugely valuable in terms of gaining experience, gaining exposure within organizations. Hugely valuable. We just got some funding through the Educational Trust to look at virtual internships in the context of some of the changes that happened during COVID, to try and understand the relative value of those and how organizations can do them better. But I would say, yeah, work experience is hugely important. And if you look at what differentiates the students that come from UL, and like when you look at the employment data from the HEA surveys, the people who actually end up in work, number one in the country is UL out of the 7 universities, and number 2 is DCU. For those that end up in work, a lot of the other metrics count further education, but that's undoubtedly due to the work experience. So work experience is hugely valuable if you can get it.
So David, I would say that it's 2 o'clock. We will have, like, let's say we'll wrap up in maybe 5 to max 10 minutes so that people who are connected know when we're going to finish. I would just put together another couple of questions that are here, and I'll finish with a final question before we wrap this up. So actually someone is asking if in your research you included global recruiting data from global recruitment agencies, which I think this is kind of an easy, yeah, I think he's making reference to the research that you talked about.
Yeah, no, we didn't have that. We had a couple of the big recruitment agencies as part of our focus groups. And they certainly have some very rich insights into terms of some of the skills that the likes of some of the multinationals relocating to Ireland have, and they're very well informed in terms of what employers are looking for in the market, but it tends to be what they're looking for here and now. But they weren't actually participants in our research beyond that, so I don't have any great insights from them.
And then there's let's say one question, which is, I don't know if it's more a prediction or I would interpret it also in terms of changes in the way we work. So he's the fact that we're massively actually working remotely at the moment. It's here to stay, or are we going all back to the offices?
Yeah, so a really interesting question, and I think we're certainly in the biggest live experiment of this question that we've ever seen. So my sense on this is, if you read a lot of the narrative on remote working, it's positioned to be this great advancement that benefits everybody. Actually, when you drill into the data, it's not necessarily quite so positive for everyone. Firstly, the percentage of people that are working remotely is lower than we might expect. So prior to COVID, it was about 14%. During COVID, only about 40-something, less than 45% of the workforce in Ireland were working remotely. The rest had to go to work, right? So still for a lot of people, working means going to the office. For those that were able to work remotely, obviously, they benefited hugely in terms of their jobs being maintained, so they could continue to work remotely. They benefited hugely from their physical health being safer, as they weren't having to go to the workplace. But we also know that we had significant challenges. So we know there was a hugely gendered impact of working from home, where we saw female employees particularly impacted in terms of the increased caring responsibilities that came with working from home, particularly when schools were closed, but even around elderly relatives. And we also saw a huge negative impact in terms of mental health and well-being, because people lost the social interaction and social companionship from the workplace. So there's two big trends that negatively impact on people because of home working. We also know that home working is effective for tasks that are done independently. So a piece of work that I need to do on my own. So if I'm preparing for this talk, I can do that at home. But where work is collaborative, we know that remote working can be much less effective because we're not co-located. We know that from past research on remote working, that there's a kind of tipping point of 50% of your time when the impact on innovation becomes apparent. So teams are less innovative when they spend less than half their time together. So my prediction is that we'll end up with a more hybrid model of work for people whose work can be done remotely. My best guess is, 20 to 40% of people's time will be remote, and the rest will be in the office. I think even, if you look at some of the big tech companies that have allowed people to work from home, I think, I think all of their communications say where that's possible, and what percentage of their employees are still coming to the workplace, I don't know. But I think for the average person, the positive is hopefully some more flexibility in terms of their work week, which would make a huge difference. But I don't expect that more than half of people's time on average will be working from home moving forward. I'd be very surprised.
It's interesting the way you frame the questions on the fact that we are in a big experiment at the moment, on how this is all working. So I just want to finish asking one final comment, a quick one, just like a statement on the fact of whether the meaning of talent will change.
Yeah, so that's something we've been thinking about and something we've been writing about. So, a lot of my research on talent management is really trying to understand not from an individual employee point of view, but from a work design point of view as an organization. How do I understand where value comes in our organization? And what we talk about is trying to identify those jobs in your organization where the most value is created, and where the difference between an average performer and a top performer is the greatest. So our starting point is really strategy and where value comes from your organization. What we've seen in the context of the pandemic is national governments have made priority lists of people who are critical to the economy. So obviously healthcare workers, but frontline workers in supermarkets, bin collectors, people who kept our economy moving during the worst of the lockdowns. And I think organizations have had some short-term recognition that these people are actually really important for them to be effective. Unfortunately, I think it's likely that in a lot of sectors, that short-term value will be forgotten very quickly. If you look at how organizations have responded, so if you look at retail, for example, most organizations have responded to the value created by frontline workers through bonuses and other short-term measures, rather than actually raising their levels of pay and improving their conditions of work. So, once the worst of the pandemic is over, the strong likelihood is a lot of those will revert to normal, and people will continue to be, the hierarchy of jobs will continue largely similar. I think we will certainly see some discussion around the competencies of effective leaders moving forward, because we've seen the importance of leaders being able to make decisions without data, to be more agile. There's a number of questions there. So I think leadership competency profiles might evolve in different ways. But honestly, I think, we'll probably go back to a lot of the way we did things in the past. We saw after 9/11, people said people will never travel again. There'll never be business travel. We've seen other recessions predict great changes. I'm a skeptic on how great the lasting changes might be.
No, thank you very much, David, for these very insightful answers to all the questions and for your presentation. There's a lot of hope in the way the future work is going to happen. Actually, in a way, the future is now. And we really thank you for your time and for sharing your expertise and your knowledge in this field. And I think all the participants, if we were in the same place at the moment, would absolutely join me in thanking you for this time and for this webinar this morning. For those participants interested in following the series on the future work for this week, at the same time, every day there will be a webinar from today to Friday the 11th. And you can always find the registration link in the DCU Business School and the Irish Institute for Digital Business channels. So I thank you again, David, our Professor David Collings, and I wish everyone a good week with this topic of the future work. And I hope to see you soon in person, whenever it will be possible.
Thanks so much, Martha. And thanks everyone for coming along. Cheers.
Goodbye.